Leo Hickman, editor of The Carbon Brief. Thank you very much for an interview for A Restored Earth. I wanted to start by asking you to describe Carbon Brief. I read your emails religiously every morning, and I wanted to get a flavour for my listeners.
Well, sure, thank you. So, Carbon Brief is a UK-based website which specialises in writing about both climate science, latest developments in climate science, and also around the related policy response to what climate science is kind of telling us. And that predominantly, I guess, is energy-related policy, both here in the UK and the EU, but we look kind of globally as well, particularly some of the key countries. So the key countries where we know some of the biggest emissions are coming from, so the Chinas, the Indias, the US, etc. So there's 7 of us in total. So we've got, all of us are journalists, and we've got a couple of specialist science writers, a couple of specialist policy writers. We also, I guess, are known for doing a lot of visual journalism. So we do a lot of data journalism, which ends up sort of becoming kind of interactive maps or infographics and things like this. So the way I kind of broadly describe our journalism is kind of explainer journalism. We're trying to explain what the science is saying, and some of it's quite complicated and nuanced, and we try and explain that. And then with things like the policy response, trying to explain what's happening on the global level, for example, in the United Nations at that level, and also down at the national or even subnational level sometimes. So explaining, for example, the UK Climate Change Act, the legal instrument that the UK signed up to in 2008, which sets a period of every 5 years an ever-reducing carbon budget, which essentially is more or less what the Paris Agreement on climate change essentially follows a similar model. So this was the agreement signed in late 2015, which virtually all the world's countries signed up to, which pushes out sort of at the moment to about 2030 a series of national pledges, so each country around the world coming to the table, coming to the United Nations and laying down their own pledge of what they will do themselves in terms of emission reductions and other measures such as tackling deforestation and other issues related to overall reducing emissions. So in general we report and try and explain all of those developments going on. We're not a hard news publication. We tend to be slightly more sort of analytical in the journalism that we produce. We also do big sort of deep interviews with kind of key players in this topic. But yeah, that's kind of the sort of place where we are within the wider kind of landscape.
That's great. And I imagine you have a global readership. I mean, probably numbers in the millions by the time you add it all up.
We'd like to think so. So we have, as you already suggested, we have a daily and a weekly email that goes out to subscribers. The daily email effectively rounds up or summarises the last 24 hours of global media coverage, English language media coverage around energy and climate related issues. So whatever the New York Times has written, whatever the Guardian or whatever, and that's quite a neat product, and we have a lot of people that sign up to that, and our audience for that are, I guess, people who in some way, shape or form are professionally involved in climate change. They might be a policymaker, they might be an NGO, they might be an academic, they might be a journalist themselves, anyone who's kind of got some kind of professional interest. We kind of describe it as the blagger's email. So you can get the idea is that you could have read our email quickly and go into your morning meeting and pretend that you've read all the world's media and you're completely up to speed.
Funny you should say that.
And so in terms of our audience, I think roughly, I haven't got the figures here, but about a third of our readers are within the UK. About a third of our readers are in North America, predominantly obviously the US. And then the rest of the third are mixed between a lot of EU, so Germany, Belgium, kind of Brussels related people reading from the EU perspective. But it's quite pleasing to see that, for example, we're getting more and more readers in India and places like that, Australia. So the Anglosphere generally. but a surprising amount of readers in Germany, for example, places that have maybe not have English as their first language, but certainly have good English.
Great. Thank you, Leo. I read it every morning, as I said, and I often have this emotion at 9:30, which is roughly characterised as a mixture of optimism and gloom, because on the one hand I read about great stuff that's happening around the world and news of progress being made, and on the other I am reminded of the latest science which suggests that ocean acidification is happening quicker than we even thought, and that the political moment is very complex and so on. And so I wanted to explore with you, this is supposed to be an optimistic book that I'm writing, but what's it like to be Leo Hickman, who's reading the world's press daily on climate and environment? And how do you feel? Are we winning? Are we losing? Are we way off? Are we riding the wave sort of unprecedentedly exciting?
I think you're right. I think, depending which day you wake up, you can sometimes feel days where it feels like things are moving forward, then you get a setback. So it does feel a bit like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or sometimes even 2 steps back, 1 step forward. But I think there have been, over the last, I've been reporting on this topic of climate change for at least a decade or so, and there have been some key moments along that trajectory or that timeline. Obviously, the Paris Agreement at the end of 2015 was a pretty key moment. I think everyone who was there in Paris, and we were all there reporting on it, everyone there knew that it was a big moment. There's never been a moment when all the countries have agreed to do something in that way, not just for climate change, but generally. There's very few examples where you've got that level of consensus. And then, a matter of a few months later, you have an election in the US where a president who's been campaigning by saying climate change is a hoax invented by the Chinese, and all that kind of rhetoric and misinformation spread on the campaign trail seems to have now seeped into the presidency as well. And you are left wondering what one of the world's biggest emitters, if their leader has that attitude, that's got to be a setback for global efforts to try and reduce emissions. And yet, at the same time, you then have organisations like the International Energy Agency publishing information saying that for the 3rd year in a row, emissions have actually stalled at a global level. Attitudes towards burning of coal in China seem, on a political and at a kind of city level, seem to be changing very, very rapidly. And if China doesn't get off coal, then it's kind of irrelevant what everyone else does. So there's some positive, particularly when you look in some key countries, there are some big signs of positivity. And it does feel a bit like a turning of the tanker to some degree. I mean, you're not going to stop the rate of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions overnight. It's going to be a journey that's going to take, a few decades to get to the levels that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has recommended. So this kind of body of scientists that meet and publish an assessment report every 6-7 years or so. Their key recommendation, 3 or 4 years ago, was that by the end of this century, humanity needs to have got off fossil fuels, and by the second half of the century, we need to be producing net zero emissions, and that was effectively what the Paris Agreement signed up to. So, I mean, there's ways that you can account for those emissions and slice and dice it, but it effectively does mean, unless we're going to capture emissions and store them underground in a kind of epic scale, which is a possibility, but so far remains technically elusive or not commercially tested at scale. If that doesn't happen, then we are going to have to stop burning fossil fuels, and that doesn't just mean coal and oil. That means, natural gas, which many people are saying could be a sort of bridging type fuel for the next 2 or 3 decades, perhaps. But it feels like one of those equations where every section of the pie has to be dealt with. It doesn't feel like you can just deal with, say, power sector emissions, although those are key. You've also got to deal with transport, and yet you see signs of positivity with, the electrification of vehicles, which in just the same way that you're seeing a revolution going on with renewables, and you're seeing solar, the deployment and rollout of solar power happening much faster than anyone predicted, and the cost falling. Equally, you're seeing some changing signs all the time about where or what the speed in which we'll move away from the combustion engine to battery and electrified transport, how quickly that can happen. I think that will be one of the key things, not just how we decarbonise the power sector, but the transport sector is clearly going to be essential. I don't think, 10 years or so ago, I was writing for The Guardian, I was writing a book about the impact of tourism around the world, and at the time it was in vogue to say, well, let's all just stop flying, which is a very difficult thing to say. Humanity's got very, very used to the idea of hypermobility. 100 years ago, we didn't have cars, and we all very, very quickly got used to and our whole lifestyle is built around mobility. We commute to work, we go and see our extended family that live in other parts of the country or in other countries. It's very, very difficult to see how the world would be convinced not to continue down that hypermobile route. So tackling transport emissions is going to be a very crucial part of the pie, and I think that there is definitely positivity around that. You can always look at climate change and say nothing's happening fast enough, and to some degree that's always true. But it does feel different to where we were, give or take a US president or so. But generally, it feels like the penny has to a large degree dropped at a societal level. What it doesn't mean yet is it doesn't mean you've still got an awful lot of resistance to it, either organised or kind of psychological resistance to the concept of we need to quite dramatically change the way that the world goes about, powering itself. And that's always going to be, a transition that happens over a few decades. It's not going to be something that can happen overnight. So it feels like I think you have to remain hopeful that the world is kind of getting this subject, but there's going to be many, many kind of obstacles and challenges along the way, I think.
Thank you, Leo. That was a very good summary. I wanted to ask you for a couple of examples that you've been covering of where you feel progress is being made in a really exciting way. For example, I wanted to write in the book about the solar industry in Nevada state. There are a number of states in the US, but and on forests, I want to talk about a number of countries which have managed or are managing to significantly reduce deforestation. But are there particular case studies that you find particularly inspiring of cities or of companies or of countries that are doing the right thing on climate policy in different guises, whether it's on the energy sector or on the natural environment?
Not particularly at the kind of company level, I think. There's definitely progressive companies who do seem to... I think that it's an attitude change thing. It's the moment a company, or even a country, views... somehow embeds a kind of carbon price within its thinking and sees that this is you can't just freely pump carbon into the atmosphere. You've got to internalise that externality, as people always say. And when you see companies that are genuinely progressive and they look forward and see this is going to hurt our bottom line, either us individually as a company or as our whole sector, if we don't sort this issue out, and do that sort of forward scanning and forward horizon scanning kind of process, which any good company should do. And look out, 10, 20 years ahead and see that their sector is going to be gravely impacted by whatever the impact of climate change may be. And it may not be a direct impact, like sea level rise or warming temperatures or increasing or intensity of storms or whatever. It may be, to some degree, an indirect impact. So it may be that climate change shifts demographic patterns somewhere else in the world, and that affects the supply chain somewhere else, or it causes a certain form of type of migration away or affects your workforce or something. There's lots of subtle ways that this could play out, and you do see some, particularly in Paris, you saw some pretty progressive companies who, even 5 years ago, you wouldn't have put their name down on a list of likely people who would be at a summit like that. In terms of specific case studies, I don't know.
The UK Climate Act, I suppose, is one.
Yeah, I mean it does still seem quite remarkable that we're now nearly 10 years on from when that was. I mean, I remember at the time, the year or so leading up to that, and it still seems remarkable that it went through the Commons with remarkably barely any resistance or voting against it, and that is genuinely a piece of legislation that led the world. I mean, you still hear people saying that now in other countries, who that very notion that, which again was to some degree largely sort of copied for the Paris Agreement, this idea that you would set yourself 5-year periods of carbon budgeting. I mean, in a way, it's a very classic kind of British way of dealing with it. It's a kind of an accountant's way of it's almost a kind of nicely bureaucratic way of doing it, that you sort of set yourself a goal and you work your way towards it, which is a pretty sensible way of doing it. You've got a distant issue, a distant problem. Let's progressively ratchet up our journey towards hitting that long-term goal. And I think it really was, and what I particularly it's got a little bit forgotten about over time, but the original idea about the 80% reduction by 2050 against 1990 levels, which is the core pledge or the core commitment of the Climate Change Act, that was actually formulated and assessed from a kind of scientific point of view, that by 2050 we have to have parity across the world, per capita parity, in terms of everyone on the planet being responsible for the same amount of emissions. And I think off the top of my head it was calculated that everyone on the planet by 2050 needs to be responsible for about 2 tons of CO2 per capita, versus the 10 tons or whatever it was back 10 years ago when in the UK anyway, when the Act was signed. So it was quite a neat way of, and actually quite a fair and equitable way of saying, look, we're not just the UK, we're one country in amongst 200 odd other countries around the world. We're a population, an island of 50-60 million people on a planet of 7 billion people, and we've all got to do our fair share. I think that was a particularly progressive and admirable part of the calculation that went into that. How did we decide it should be 80% reduction? As it turns out, the science since then has suggested we actually need to go further than that. So we've seen recently in the last few months the Committee on Climate Change, the kind of official body that advises the government on these carbon budgets, saying if you want to be in line with the Paris Agreement, which went further than the original 2 degrees limit that the original Climate Change Act was designed around, to say you need to go well below 2 degrees C, and ideally 1.5 degrees C. This is the level of warming since pre-industrial times. Then you're going to have to go that extra mile, and it now looks like that 80% reduction, not right now, but probably in the next few years, will actually have to be tightened further, which has some pretty big implications for what the UK has to do in the next, certainly by the mid-2030s. Much of the UK economy, which we know and love right now, has to be decarbonised almost to zero, certainly in large parts of the power sector, and that's pretty challenging to do that. But you can only get there if you set yourself a longer term target and a period of sort of ratcheting smaller, sort of shorter term targets. So yeah, I think the Climate Change Act has been pretty. It has been a pretty influential piece of legislation around the world, and there are, I can't remember how many there are, but there are, a few dozen other countries now that have actually put into law their own targets.
Thank you. And is Carbon Brief sort of agnostic about the virtues of the different technologies? Because you mentioned natural gas and the criticism that's made, but also there are arguments from Dieter Helm and others that there's no way of making the energy transition without it. Equally on nuclear, there are divisions in our environmental world between those in favour and against. But what's the view on technology from your perspective? Is it just to see what's the most effective and the most efficient?
Well, in many ways, the debate around energy policy is incredibly complex, but in many ways incredibly simple. Because of the Climate Change Act and because of the Paris Agreement, we know where we need to be, both as a country and as a kind of global community, by X date in this century.
Yeah.
So if we all signed up to that, we all agree on that, we know we've got to reduce our emissions by a known percentage compared to where we are today. So once everyone's agreed to that and taken that on board, which I'm not saying it is totally there yet, but once you have those cold numbers there in front of you, and then when you know what the different forms of, say, power generation, coal, gas, nuclear, renewables, etc., hydro, once you know that, the scientists have told you and the engineers have told you how much CO2 is emitted per kilowatt hour of that power being generated via that form, then there's some pretty simple maths can be applied to say, okay, well, if you've got to get there, you can carve it all up accordingly, as long as you will stay within that pledge, the bounds of that pledge. The reason Carbon Brief doesn't have a policy position on any particular power source, because we don't really feel there's a need to do that, because we're a very numbers and data driven kind of, we try and let just the evidence and the numbers do the talking. We don't need to have a particular view. You can just sort of present the numbers as they are, and in a way we'd rather present readers with a range of facts and figures, and then they can do the takeaway on what they feel should be right. I mean, it's who are we to say whether one way is right or wrong? We're just saying, here's all the numbers, you can make your own views accordingly. And to some degrees, to have a view on something would be arguably a detraction from our journalism, which we're trying to just do very plain and simple journalism. If we suddenly came into an article and said, right, we're pro or anti, I don't know, nuclear, we know from experience that just distorts everyone's reading of that article, because then suddenly all the pro-nuclear people are either angry or happy, or and people just go off into their own separate camps and whatever. And it's quite an emotive subject and carries quite a lot of baggage historically over where you are. We feel it's just easier, why get involved in that? Let's just, the numbers don't need to be argued over. So that's the kind of position we come from. It's almost as a way just to not allow our sort of journalism to be clouded and muddied or misinterpreted, because we've thrown in our own position or our own view on it.
That's very good, and I assume the same applies to this whole issue of negative emissions technologies, which the science would appear to suggest are necessary, and yet we know that there's a great variation between the different NETs, so-called, that exist. And again, a lot of controversy surrounding some of them, just as there is controversy surrounding the idea that we might do various forms of geoengineering to address the climate crisis.
Well, negative emissions are a really good example, actually, because when we all got back from the Paris Agreement meeting in late 2015, we had every year in January, like most organisations, we had a kind of year ahead planning away day meeting where we all sat down in a room and sort of thrashed out what are we going to do this year, what are our key objectives and topics to cover. And it was pretty obvious at Paris that suddenly this thing called negative emissions technology had suddenly ballooned up to being this big issue, because slightly out of nowhere, as part of the compromise and part of the political haggling, this 1.5 degree target suddenly got written into the Paris Agreement. So the target, the deal actually agrees to limiting warming to quote, well below 2 degrees C, but it adds in pursuant of 1.5 degrees, and that was effectively seen as an addition to appease some of the low-lying island nation states, some of the developing countries which had long been arguing that 2 degrees was too high a target to set because there were too many impacts that would impact some of those most vulnerable countries. So, in a way to bring in and make it inclusive for those most vulnerable countries, the 1.5 degree target was added. But what the IPCC report just a year or two before then had actually pointed out pretty starkly in some ways is that most of the modelling for 1.5 out for to keep emissions so there's not 1.5 or more warming over the rest of the century. What vast majority of the modelling showed was that you cannot do that without relying on so-called negative emissions technology, essentially technology that sucks CO2 out of the air, captures it and allows you to bury it underground. And so we got back from Paris and said, well, we're going to have to do this subject in quite a big way because this is clearly going to be a big talking point. So by April of 2016, so 4 months or so after Paris, we published a week-long series of articles explaining the different technologies. There were sort of 10 or so key technologies, the different ways that you could do this, sort of sucking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. We then did a range of interviews with a whole wide range of people who have very different and contrasting views on this. As you can imagine, people from scientists and academics through to NGOs, through to sort of people with a lot of policy experience about saying what the reality of this is, and views from different countries as well. And that, to us, that was a very good example of what Carbon Brief is here for. Hopefully, is that we can take a kind of knotty and cheery and nuanced and technically challenging subject and try and explain it in a calm, calm and hopefully authoritative way, so that it can be read without the noise of having an opinion about it. So again, like we say with energy, we don't have a position. We're not for or against negative emissions. We're just saying this is what the options are according to what scientists are saying. These are the implications of using it. These are the costs of trying to use it, etc., etc. And then hopefully readers can go away and form their own judgment on it. Mm-hmm. But it's clearly a big and will only ever get a bigger subject. And we saw that in Oxford in September of 2016. There was a big meeting where a lot of the key scientists, climate scientists and economists, etc., who specialise around this subject of how do we get to 1.5. We went there and covered that. We were there for sort of 2 or 3 days covering that conference, and negative emissions came up a lot. That was really kind of like the elephant in the room in many ways.
Very interesting. And some of the assumptions around bioenergy carbon capture and storage are very problematic in terms of land use and food security, one could argue.
Well, a classic example is, I remember being at the IPCC meeting it was in Berlin in 2014. This was the Working Group 3 report so this is the report that dealt with the economics of climate mitigation. What are the most cost-effective pathways for us tackling climate change? And I remember BECCS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, a form of negative emissions, and probably the most likely form. It's the one that you see most often referenced in the literature. That suddenly was being presented as this big thing that everyone needed. And I remember thinking at the time, what is BECCS? I've never even heard this thing. And I looked at some of the modelling and just saw huge assumptions for BECCS increasing for the rest of the century. And I remember being in one of the rooms where the Brazilian delegation raised their hand and said something along the lines of, you know, they didn't say it explicitly, but the implication was that they saw this as a huge opportunity for Brazil. The idea that they've got lots of land where they could grow this biomass, they could then ship it and sell it to other countries where they could burn it for power. So you basically burn the biomass, generate the electricity, like we do here in Yorkshire at Drax. Then they would capture the emissions, bury them underground, and then that would be a win for Brazil because they've sold a load of biomass at profit. It would be a win for the destination country because they would be doing it to reduce their emissions. And I was thinking, well, what exactly is Brazil going to do here? They've got they've got in their own country, you know, the lungs of the earth. They've got the Amazon rainforest, which, you know, for many, many climate reasons and many other reasons, but biodiversity and fresh water, etc. You don't want to bring down those, you know, that forest. And yet we already know the pressures in Brazil around cattle ranching and, you know, land use. Is there now going to be this kind of global level kind of bioenergy market being developed in the next few decades? And if so, if Brazil are looking at that enthusiastically, thinking there's money to be made there, what land are they going to use to grow all this? Are they going to displace the cattle ranching? Are they going to displace, hopefully not the primary rainforest, or what's going to happen here? So you suddenly look into a subject like that, and there's so many question marks that quickly pop up. Whereas it's a very simple input onto a model. You can just type in, you know, BECS and give it a nice percentage going out at the end of the century. But the real world ramifications of something like that being rolled out at that kind of scale. We did a back of the envelope kind of calculation at the IPCC conference saying, well, how much land would you need to produce that level of bioenergy, biomass for bioenergy by the end of the century? And current understanding, we calculated you'd need the land the size of 2 Indias to produce that amount of biomass. So you think you've already got a population of 7 billion people, nearly 8 billion people on the planet, forecast by mid-century to be up nearly 10, 11 billion. All of those people need, you know, feeding. You've already got pressure for land, for food crops and livestock, etc. How are you going to find the equivalent of 2 Indias suddenly to produce all this biomass, as well as feeding all these people on the planet? So you immediately hit some really chewy and difficult and challenging decisions to be made about, you know, and then that sets, you know, we've in twin parallel with the Paris Agreement and the United Nations framework on climate change. We also at the same time had the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and it was very interesting watching that process playing out. So that also had some climate and energy related goals, and however many they ended up agreeing with, 15 or whatever it was, 17 I think, 17, I can't remember. Yeah. But it was very interesting in that process. You saw some of the competing tensions around, you know, feeding people, giving people a home, giving people education, giving people healthcare, giving people fresh water, and all, competing with some of those, you know, climate challenges. And I think it's very important not to see climate change in isolation as a single issue, because it's like, for many reasons, it's the ultimate environmental issue, for the simple reason that it actually cuts across virtually all other subjects. So it's very hard when you're looking at environmental issues not to let climate change kind of cloud over the whole thing. But equally, you can't really take each of those other issues, whether it's fresh water or whatever the issue is, without unpicking, or whilst ignoring the climate change challenge. It's a huge challenge, and I think that really got shown in the SDG kind of negotiations. You really began to see that.
How are we going to do this? Is it going to be just massive political leadership times 170, 196 countries, whatever? Is it huge global campaigns from civilians? Is it the enlightened practice? Is it all of the above? I mean, I'm just trying to think, you know, the scale of the transformation that we need to make is of such an order of magnitude. And there's so much good stuff happening, but most of it is having a sort of fairly modest impact. I mean, not insignificant, but modest impact in the grand scheme of things. And I'm interested how we're going to go to scale on sort of changes.
I think it will be a blend of a few things. I think it will be, so we're already seeing what they call the real world economy. So we see, solar prices plummeting, et cetera, et cetera. So some of those things will happen within the kind of, just going to happen, human civilization has dozens, hundreds of examples where there's been disruptive technological change at very, very short order. That no one could really predict at the scale and the time that it did it. So we have to sort of keep our fingers crossed to some extent, and probably fairly assume that some big things will happen, big breakthroughs, technological breakthroughs will happen that can be commercialised. Some things we haven't probably even dreamed of yet that will happen.
Sure.
That's a reassuring thought, but it's also possibly foolhardy to just. My concern is there's too many people out there known as which are kind of somewhat disparagingly referred to as the sort of techno fixers, the people that go, "Oh, don't worry, the engineers will sort all this out," and they'll come along, they'll ride their white stallion over the horizon and save us all. To some extent, that is partly true, and there's an element of saying, well, if we're relying on that, let's help them as much as possible with their R&D support and government backing for research projects and stuff. But I think you can't totally rely on that. I think sadly there will be, you just have to look through human history to see what makes us change our ways. And sure, there's some technological changes that always have dramatic change. But there's also, as a species, we don't tend to take our hand out of the fire until we can actually feel the burning fingertips. We take things to the wire as a species. We always have, if you look back through history. So I think there will be an element of us having to go through some pretty painful impact moments. I mean, I've effectively been asking this question to policymakers for more than a decade, off the record, what is it actually going to take for there to be meaningful change? And it's sometimes slightly depressing, the amount of people that come back and say, well, to be honest, it's going to take a big impact somewhere for there to be genuine political change. And we've seen hints and moments of that before, where you've had like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, or you've had a Hurricane Sandy hitting, New York and New Jersey, etc., where you've seen, to some degree, short-term political turmoil being caused by a big impact, weather event. And I think if the scientists are right and we're likely to see more and more of these events play out, I think the reality of some of those will begin to chip away and change kind of public opinion on this to some extent. But I think that won't be enough in and of itself. So you'll have a blend of things like technological change. I think your book is sensible in the way that it's presenting the positivity around people don't want to climb that hill and go over the other side, partly because they don't want the journey or to expend the energy to go up the hill, but they also don't know what's on the other side of the hill. So the more they can be reassured and shown that actually the other side is a better place to be. It will be a cleaner cities, breathing in air. We've seen that impact already happening in places like Beijing. Even in London, we're seeing the air pollution debate pretty dramatically changing public opinion, and politicians always being led by public opinion, it seems, or the public giving a safe space for politicians to jump into. So I think it will be a mixture of all of those things, really. And I think just the relentless sort of reality of a changing climate will, it will over time. You see the polling on this. It does, it's slow, never fast enough. But you do see attitudes are changing, and it's also very striking in the polling data that it's always the youngest people who are really alive to this being an issue. It's going to be on their watch. It's going to be in their lifespan. It's the older generation that nearly inevitably seem to be less bothered about it, or less sort of, or maybe being more cynical about it. And I think as the passage of time moves on, I think that will be part of the changing reality of it. you go into a school these days. I've done the odd talk in schools and things, and you really see very different attitudes amongst younger people around this issue. And I think, I think attitudes will, they will change. I think they've kind of got to change really, because I think we as a species live very much in the present tense. That's one of our failings in a way. We're not very good at very, very long-term thinking. We tend to live in the now, which I think is kind of understandable because there's many, immediate pressing concerns, people putting food on the table and paying bills and things like that, and the security people want in their immediate day-to-day lives. So to see what is perceived or sold as a long-term problem that's going to be something not just tomorrow, but further down the century. I think as that time plays out, I think all of these things will mix together to move us in a much better and more positive direction.
Brilliant, Leo. Well, thank you very much indeed, and it's been so good to talk to you. And the Carbon Brief is such a wonderful thing. So thank you for your daily work in educating the world about the issue. Thank you.